renewing their fight to stop the financing of militant extremism. Qatar and the United States sign a deal vowing closer cooperation, a deal they say has been a year in the drafting. What's more, both countries say the timing of this deal has nothing to do with the ongoing diplomatic crisis between Qatar and several of its neighbors.
Qatar has always been falsely accused by the countries laying siege to Qatar. Qatar was the first country today to sign the Memorandum of Understanding with the United States, and we call on the countries imposing the siege on Qatar to join us as signatories to this memorandum.
Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt severed all ties with Doha on June 5th on the grounds it supports terrorism. The result? Regional economic and political isolation. Kuwait is mediating. With their own economic and military ties at risk, the U.S. and other countries back Kuwait's efforts.
My role here is to support the efforts of the Emir of Kuwait and the Kuwaiti mediator to bring what we can to the discussions to help both sides more fully understand the concerns of the relative parties and also point out possible solutions to those.
On Wednesday, Rex Tillerson flies to the Saudi city of Jeddah to meet with Qatar's opponents. Now, no one thinks that the crisis will be over after that trip. If anything, Tillerson's job is simply to keep the Kuwaiti mediation on track. And as the Kuwaiti Emir said in a statement on Tuesday evening, that this crisis is ultimately resolved by the members of the GCC themselves. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Kuwait City.
Well, the four Arab states leading the boycott on Qatar issued a joint statement following that meeting between Rex Tillerson and Qatar's foreign minister. So let's take a look in more detail at what they said. The four nations say they'll monitor Qatar's seriousness in fighting the financing of terrorism. They reiterated their accusations against Doha, which includes supporting extremism and spreading hate speech. And they also accused Doha of breaking previous agreements, in particular a 2013 accord in which Qatar promised to stop interfering in its neighbours' internal affairs.
A warm welcome for Britain's Foreign Secretary meeting the Emir of Qatar to lend his support to efforts to resolve the crisis in the Gulf. For more than a month, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt have maintained an embargo on Qatar. Boris Johnson says he believes the dispute can be resolved and backed Kuwait in its efforts to mediate the crisis.
I'm here to give support to the Emir of Kuwait and the Kuwaiti government, who are leading the work of trying to de-escalate the situation and bring people together.
Johnson had earlier visited Kuwait and had also held talks with the Crown Princes of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. He admitted it was unlikely a solution would be found immediately, but he didn't expect it to descend into a military conflict.
There's no possibility of a military escalation. On the contrary, what people want to do, I think, is to, we think the blockade was unwelcome, and we hope there will be a de-escalation. But of course, we are supporting our Kuwaiti friends.
Speaking at the G20 summit, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan echoed the view that a diplomatic solution was needed.
There are allegations against Qatar, and we believe those to be unfair and sanctions to be unjust. Just like all countries in the world, the sovereignty of Qatar must be respected. The peace, stability and security of our brothers in the Gulf are as important to us as that of the Turkish people. Countries who have weight in the region should work towards a reasonable solution.
The four blockading nations accuse Qatar of funding extremists, something Qatar denies. Their demands include Qatar curbing ties with Iran, shutting down Al Jazeera and closing a Turkish military base in Qatar. Qatar has rejected those demands but says it's willing to negotiate. On Friday, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt said they'll now take all necessary measures as and when they see fit. As yet, there is no indication of what that might mean. The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is due to visit Kuwait on Monday. Miriam Nahond, Al Jazeera. For almost a month, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt have maintained an embargo on Qatar. But it took those countries almost 3 weeks to finally set out what they wanted, a 13-point list of demands that Qatar had 10 days to comply with.
This list of demands made to be rejected.
Both sides refused to budge, and the time passed. Now confirmation from Kuwait, which is acting as a mediator, that the blockading countries have accepted the Kuwaiti Emir's request for the deadline to be extended by 48 hours. Qatar says the blockade is a violation of international law, a position that has growing support.
You've got support from outside. You've got a developing relationship with Turkey that's standing with them. You've got a large presence of the United States. You've got a developing relationship that goes back a decade with Iran. You've got much of the free world that is very, very supportive of its independence and of Al Jazeera. I think at this point, this is about the GCC trying to save face, to back down, and try to claim some sense of a victory.
The demands include cutting ties with Iran, shutting down Al Jazeera, closing a Turkish military base, and cutting ties with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia has consistently said the list is non-negotiable, while Qatar says the list of demands was never realistic. The only party so far to present something of a middle ground has been the United States, with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson offering suggestions that might form the basis for dialogue. This was followed up by phone calls by the US President Donald Trump to the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The next 2 days presents a window of opportunity for both sides to talk, but at this point there aren't any plans for them to talk to each other. Miriam Nahond, Al Jazeera.
It's one of Lebanon's largest Syrian refugee camps. It's also among the best organized. Al Yasmin refugee camp is paid for by Qatar Charity. Residents here are provided with food, water, shelter, and healthcare. And for Khala Diab, living at Al Yasmin has also given her much-needed peace of mind. Originally from Homs, she fled from the fighting in Syria to Lebanon 6 years ago. But up until moving here last year, she and her 4 children had little choice but to travel from camp to camp, looking for somewhere safe and stable to live.
Thank God we were able to find this place. Without this tent, we would have had to live on the streets without food and shelter. My kids would have died, but thanks to Qatar Charity, we have a tent, food, clothing and electricity. Without their help, we wouldn't have survived.
Established more than 30 years ago, Qatar Charity is Qatar's largest NGO. It has worked extensively with several UN aid agencies, as well as the World Food Programme, Oxfam, and USAID. Since the start of the Syrian conflict, more than 8 million Syrian refugees have been helped by Qatar Charity, including in Turkey, which hosts the world's largest Syrian refugee population, and from where Qatar sends aid to those in need inside Syria. But Qatar Charity's support for Syrians and others is under threat. Last week, as part of a growing crisis among Gulf states, 4 countries, including Saudi Arabia, accused several Qatar-based charities of being involved in terrorism, including Qatar Charity, an accusation the Qatari government strongly rejects. It's also a claim many living in the Gaza Strip find hard to believe. More than half of Palestinians living in Gaza have received direct support from Qatar Charity and other Qatari aid agencies. Mustafa Kalaja says without their support, his family would have little to eat after breaking their fast during the month of Ramadan.
Thank God we were able to find this place. Without this tent, we would have to live on the streets without food and shelter. My kids would have died. But thanks to Qatar Charity, we have a tent, food, clothing, and electricity. Without their help, we wouldn't have survived.
The United Nations says it's not bound by what it described as Saudi Arabia's so-called terrorist list, while the Qatari government has condemned the allegations. But for people who rely on the support of Qatar Charity, the deepening crisis in the Gulf has them increasingly concerned. Imtiaz Taib, Al Jazeera, Bar Ilyas in eastern Lebanon.
French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Theresa May are urging all sides to take urgent steps to de-escalate the situation. Macron had a conversation with the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, and Theresa May spoke on the phone with the newly appointed Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Meanwhile, the German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel met with his Saudi counterpart, Adel Al-Jubeir, during a tour of the Gulf region.
The best solution to come out of this conflict, then I think, is a mutual agreement to end all support of terrorists or extremist organizations. We all know that it's not state-organized, but often by private individuals.
Qatar rejects accusations it funds armed groups and has delivered its response to the 13 demands from Saudi Arabia. Close